Hello, Joe Nickell. How are you? Why do people believe easily in the paranormal phenomena?
I think that the secret to the interest of people in the paranormal is that most of the subjects tap into our hopes and our fears. If you think about extraterrestrials, for example, if they are coming to the planet Earth, this is a happy message that we are not alone in the universe. So that's good. But they might mean us harm, so that sparks our fear. The same with ghosts. Ghosts provide the happy message that we live after we die, but we're not sure that we're not afraid if we walk by a haunted graveyard at night. We get maybe afraid of the unknown. All of these subjects, whether it's psychic power or what have you, have some relevance to our wishes or our fears. We wish we could predict the future. We're afraid of monsters. All of these paranormal subjects have some component of fear or hope or both. And so since hopes and fears are more emotional than they are rational, they capture people's emotions. And it's very hard then to use the reason to argue them out of a belief. It makes it very difficult. We can present rational evidence, but if they're feeling it in their heart, it may be very difficult to have an effect.
Professor Nickell.
Do you want me to look at the camera or look up at you? Probably better if you're sitting in...
Look at me, please.
Yeah.
So, is it not possible parapsychological science then?
You mean is it impossible that people have psychic power?
Yeah.
Certainly there's no good evidence for it. The problem with the paranormal is that it's difficult to say that something's impossible. We like to not judge in advance of investigating. We prefer, rather than say there are no haunted houses, we prefer to actually go to the haunted house and find out what's going on. But there is no good evidence that any of the things that we think of associated with parapsychology, like haunted houses...
please come to Eric's desk.
Sorry, let me start over. There's very poor evidence that any of the things studied by parapsychology are real. And by parapsychology, I would mean such things as ESP, including telepathy and clairvoyance and psychokinesis. Or haunted houses is often included as part of the world of the parapsychologist. I've been in more haunted houses than Casper, the friendly ghost. I've never seen a house that I thought was haunted. I've found haunted people who had an idea of a ghost and who imagined many things. I've caught phony psychics. Recently I exposed a psychic out in California who was doing tricks. She would put on a blindfold and then she could read the numbers on dice, and I showed that she was peeking. She had objects placed in a little box, and she was handed the box and she would hold it up and tell what the object was. And I showed that under cover of her fingers she used her thumbs to push the lid of the box up, and it was a trick. There are statistical studies in laboratories that purport to show that people have extrasensory perception. Most of those are very flawed studies. In some of the early studies, they found that people were allowed to do what's called optional stopping. That is, in doing some tests to see if people could guess a card, they were allowed to stop whenever they wanted. If you allow that, you can always quit when your score is high. and you'll inflate your results. You should agree in advance of a test that you will go so many cards and stop. And when you do that, the scores tend to even out. And similar problems affect other parapsychological areas.
The next question. Is there any real evidence of the UFOs until today?
There is a lot of evidence for UFOs, a lot of evidence, but it's very poor quality. Much evidence, but poor quality. People do indeed see unidentified flying objects. They see lights in the sky at night, or they see some a dark object in the sky, or a silvery bright object in the sky in the day. When these are thoroughly investigated, they tend to become no longer UFOs, but what we call IFOs, identified flying objects. Many of them turn out to be balloons, such as weather balloons or even prank balloons. Some turn out to be meteors or secret government airplane tests, or in one recent case in Phoenix, Arizona, there were bright lights over Phoenix that caused a great deal of disturbance. Those turned out to be flares parachuted by the Air Force in an experiment, a nighttime experiment to light up an area. And they came forward and admitted that they had conducted this experiment, and that explained it. In another case that I investigated, police officers engaged a small fiery UFO in Kentucky, and it frightened them. The UFO seemed to chase them, and they eventually took evasive action. Turned out that a day or so later, a young man came forward, and he had been playing around, made a little small balloon, and had some candles lit, and it had just lifted off beautifully and was glowing nicely when the helicopter ran into it. And wasn't a flying saucer from another planet. It was simply a little harmless lighted balloon. And that's what usually happens with UFOs. There will always be a small percentage that aren't explained, simply because we don't get lucky and find out what it was. But it could be a blimp, an airplane, space debris, satellite. People see all sorts of things in the sky, but the least likely explanation is that they are extraterrestrial craft.
How are the paranormal beliefs connected to the religious belief?
To religious belief? Well, there oftentimes there is an overlap between religious and paranormal. In some cases they're quite separate. For example, the motivation for a belief in ghosts can be both just a paranormal mystery, haunted houses, but it has implications to religion, because if ghosts exist, then we live after we die. In some cases the phenomena really has no religious angle at all. Belief in Bigfoot, for example, really doesn't have any religious implication. Weeping icons, of course, do have such an implication. But all of these stem from, I think, human desires to believe. And again, they stem from our hopes and our fears. We're afraid of monsters, but we're hopeful that we might live after we die.
Is there any evidence for an afterlife?
There is no good evidence for an afterlife. The best evidence probably is from haunted houses, where people see apparitions and report apparitions of the dead. There are many such reports, and oftentimes these reports are quite sincere. They're not hoaxes. The people are not crazy, but there are simple phenomena to explain them. For example, A very common experience is that someone wakes up in the middle of the night and sees ghosts. I've talked to many people who have had this experience and seen, for example, a dead father or another loved one who's recently passed away. Such an experience is extremely powerful to the person it occurs to. But it's a common phenomenon called a waking dream. That is, we're in the twilight between being quite awake and quite asleep. And in that twilight, we often have this experience of seeing strange imagery. So it's not proof of an afterlife, but it's regarded as such, but people have had the experience.
How about the near-death experience?
Near-death experience is interesting, but it almost certainly has to do with the physiology of the human brain. It's a type of hallucination. The feeling that people have of going down a tunnel is probably an effect of the visual cortex of the brain. The important thing to note, I believe, about near-death experiences is that people have the same experiences who are not near-death, who, say, under certain anesthesia or other drugs or in other mental states will have similar effects and are not near death. And I think that shows that it's simply an effect of the brain under certain conditions. It's a trick of the mind.
How important is the role of the imagination in the paranormal belief?
The role of the imagination in the paranormal is profound. It's always a player, as we would say. It's always an element. It seems that if you believe, for example, that your house is haunted, and I just today talked to a woman whose house is very haunted, the imagination can play many tricks. People thinking about a ghost who maybe see something move out of the corner of the eye perceive that as a ghost, and they may imagine that they've seen it dressed in a white veil, or there are certain people who are very imaginative who can conjure up their imaginings and see them very vividly. We call these people fantasy-prone people. There is an element of expectation with the paranormal that's heightened by the imagination. For example, I've investigated some cases of lake monsters, like the Loch Ness Monster, or here in New York, Silver Lake Serpent. In some of these cases, what people probably saw was a floating log, or maybe some otters, some lake otters, swimming in a line. But the person's imagination colors that visual sighting and makes of it a monster. The human ability to imagine is tremendous, and people who frequently have paranormal experiences often tend to be highly imaginative people.
What's the role of the education in the paranormal belief? What's the role
Of
education?
Well, that's a tough issue, because I'm not sure that by being more educated that you're necessarily free of superstitions. I've seen poorly educated people who very superstitious and maybe say they believe their house is haunted. I've seen college professors who might say, well, that's a silly superstition. But of course, if you're talking about poltergeist-type emanations and extrasensory perceptive phenomena, then I believe in other words, they may also believe, but they may believe in put a more educated kind of context onto it. But I believe that that our emotions are no respecters of person, that all of us are eager to believe in certain things, no matter how intelligent we are, and that even very intelligent people will grasp onto fringe beliefs. The interesting thing is that the highly intelligent person may be more able to find clever reasons why it could be possible, so that he can talk himself into a belief, even though intellectually he should know better.
Do you believe in God, and why?
We don't. Psychop does not discuss religion or politics, the two things most divisive to man, because what Psychop's mission is to actually investigate those claims that are investigatable. People ask me all the time, not only do you believe in God, which is, as far as I'm concerned, is irrelevant to my investigative work, but they'll say, do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in UFOs? My response is, it's not a question of belief. It's a question of evidence. Psychop's position is that matters of purely religious faith are not investigatable, and we don't investigate them. But things that have a physical component, the Shroud of Turin, for example, is a physical artifact, and it either did or did not wrap the body of Jesus. Or statues weep or they do not weep. We can investigate those things. And Psychop's preference is not to get into religious arguments, but to stay focused on specific claims and investigate those. I've found in dealing with the Shroud of Turin that as soon as you get from the Shroud of Turin to do you believe in God, it ends up being another shouting match that goes nowhere. But if you stick to the issue of the Shroud of Turin, then you can talk about the lack of history, Forger's Confession, the tempera paint, the radiocarbon date, and you may educate someone and may convince them that the Shroud of Turin is a 14th century forgery.
Thank you very much.